So today we begin this new sermon series that we're calling The Rest on Purpose. From now through November, we're going to be looking at this biblical concept of Sabbath and considering how this day of worship for God and a ceasing of labor can develop us as a people who trust in God's care and provision. We came up with this sermon series this summer because we thought, good, we'll be through the pandemic and we'll all be dealing with this temptation to return to hectic and full schedules that we were having before March of 2020. So this will be the perfect time, because people will have been out of pandemic mode for long enough, for us to reconsider, are we integrating those lessons that we said to ourselves about simplifying our life that we learned in the time of quarantine, or have we reverted back into old habits and patterns? Well, as you are aware, we are not quite through this pandemic yet. But I have noted, we've noted that the case numbers are dropping from the Delta variant in our area at this time, so there's a sign of hope. But I've also noticed, even with this lingering pandemic, many of us have sought to re-engage life more fully than we did in the season of quarantine, but we're doing all of those activities while still having to ask ourselves, should we be having people over to the house for dinner? Hey, don't forget your mask with your backpack for school. Hey, do you think we could have that meeting outside? I hate to cause trouble at your office, but is everybody here vaccinated? And so now we're trying to still navigate a global health crisis while also re-engaging fully with school, scouts, soccer, violin lessons, PTA meetings, bridge club, garden club, taking care of the grandkids, and volunteering. So maybe we need now, more than ever, this understanding of Sabbath rest on purpose, because we might even feel more burdened with life than we did before March of 2020. I hope you've picked up on the double meaning of the title, The Rest on Purpose. The rest on purpose means, first, that Sabbath is an intentional time, a purposeful time, when we focus on the worship of God and ceasing our labors. It isn't something that you sneak in between mowing the grass and balancing the checkbook. It's more than just an afternoon nap or a round of golf. There's a difference between Sabbath rest, purposeful rest, and recreation or free time. So one thing we're going to be looking at in these weeks is what is the purpose of our rest. The second meaning of the rest on purpose, then, is that how does this intentional day of communion with God order or structure the remaining time that we have over the course of a week? Sabbath makes time purposeful and not scattered. The Sabbath reminds us that time is a gift and it's a responsibility. So regular Sabbath keeping encourages us to make sure that the rest of life, the remaining activities we do, are carried out on purpose and not scattered or haphazardly. So we begin this series this week at the end of the creation story. Genesis gives us the story creatively and imaginatively of God forming the world. And it makes a theological declaration that the very order of the creation is out of the very identity of God's self. The first 3 days of the creation show us the sustainability as well as the creativity of God. First, you get this background. You have light and dark, sky and sea, land and plants. In the next 3 days of creation, the characters that fill the earth are filled in. Sun, moon, and stars, birds and sea creatures, animals, and finally, human beings. There's creativity in this story, and there's balance, coexistence, and structure. And you can imagine, if you wish, as this creation story plays out, that God is the maestro of an orchestra, frantically waving God's arms over the massive score that is the creation. But instead of there being violins and cellos and horns and drums in front of God, there's constellations and sunrise and lions and elephants and anteaters and antelope and deer and foxes and squirrels and stingrays and whales and all of these creatures of the earth. And finally, a human being who looks a lot like us. And God's hands keep waving, God's hair a mess, sweat at the temples from the joyful exertion of it all. And God raises the orchestra to the final crescendo and then snaps God's hands on the final note, holding them in place. And it's right there in the stillness. We're breathless in our seats. The orchestra, the creation is still, eyes fixed on the Creator. We know we've experienced something spectacular, but we don't want to give up the moment of marvel and wonder. It's that stillness before the applause, before the exhale, that moment before the bows, a moment of stillness. That's the Sabbath day. The moment of marvel and appreciation. And it's part of our experience of the creation. In fact, that stillness, that rest, that completion in inaction, that's woven in to the very patterns and rhythms of the creation of the world. We can see it in the earth. Fields left to lie fallow for a year, to replenish nutrients in the soil, carbon, nitrogen, to replenish the water-holding capacity of the soil, to allow for microorganisms to replenish and regenerate. And so the next year, when the field is planted, it can yield an even larger harvest than it had before. We see it in the rhythm of the seasons, this need for creativity and rest, the miracle of our planet that rests just perfectly at this 23.5-degree angle, enabling us to experience seasons of winter, spring, summer, and fall. And creatures, animals that hibernate, procreate, scavenge, and store, seasons of action, seasons of rest in rhythm, all built into the very alignment of our planet. Migratory patterns of birds and whales traveling to warmer climates for the purpose of mating and the rearing of young, and to cooler climates and other seasons of the year, migrating along paths and waterways that their ancestors have traveled for generation after generation. And every animal on earth, whether the largest elephant or the tiniest fruit fly, sleeps. We don't really know why, evolutionarily, that humans have to replenish their energy by this unconscious practice of sleep. Evolution would tell us, selection of species, that those that were more alert to perceived harm and dangers would be the more dominant species. So those that slept less would have a higher chance of survival. But that's not actually the case. Sleep is absolutely necessary. If you take sleep away from a living creature, it dies. Sleep impacts our metabolism, how we're able to process food, how we're able to control our emotions, whether or not we are responsive to impulses or if we have self-control. Sleep and rest is a rhythm of life. And so at the end of the creation, God hallows the Sabbath day. God designates a particular day as an intentional day of rest. God rests, and so sets the pattern for rest for the creation God makes. And note, the creation is only complete, the creation is only finished when there is rest. Rest is natural. Rest is necessary. One of the great tragedies of humanity, however, is that we don't want to stay still while the maestro's hands are held overhead in that moment of stillness. And instead, we want to come in and sneak the baton out of God's hands and write our own symphony and make our own rhythms. Things as simple as the electric light bulb, which prolongs the day for as many hours as we want before sunrise or beyond sunset so that we can get more done. The light of our screens so we can scroll through the news or the news feeds of our relatives and friends that increases our anxiety and insecurity. There's overfishing the oceans, over-cultivating the land, overuse of natural resources. So we see hurricanes grow in strength and wildfires rage and ecosystems collapse. So much suffering and sorrow, both in our personal lives and in the life of our planet, comes because we are not willing to adhere to this natural rhythm of rest. We don't acknowledge it as a part of the very created order of things. But to deny rest is to deny our very state as physical creatures in a physical world. Now, even the atheist without Genesis 2 can affirm that there are patterns of rest and action needed for the flourishing of the planet. But for the faithful like us, to deny our need to rest is to sin against God, to deny the goodness of God's creation. Because that rest is as natural as the rising of the sun, the glowing of the moon, the falling of the leaves in autumn, and the buds of flowers in the spring. So you're invited on this first Sunday of our Rest on Purpose series to accept your created state in God's ordering of the world. And an essential part of knowing that state is learning to rest. Now, this isn't some imposition being forced on you by a supernatural deity. It's a natural rhythm of life to be embraced and embodied. So attend the symphony of creation today. Marvel at the creativity and imagination and complexity of this world that God makes and sustains: light and dark, seasons, plants, animals, photosynthesis and food webs, deserts and arctic tundras, plains and meadows, mountains and valleys, streams, rivers, creeks, oceans, humans of every size, color, shape, and language. But when the final note is sounded, don't immediately rise from your seats in a standing ovation of applause, but be still, be silent. Know your place. Creation is not whole until we rest. Amen.